Okay, we're going to get into a study of Rehoboam this week. I think the first week we talked about Asa. A compromise can ultimately destroy you in the end. Last week we talked about the two pharaohs. One with Jacob, the good pharaoh. Joseph interpreted his dreams, basically saved the nation from starvation for 7 years. When he died, Joseph kissed him on his head. The pharaoh, we have to understand at that time, thought they were divine. They were divinity. They were gods. So he allowed his chariots, his horsemen, and all to go with Joseph when they buried Jacob. Which, whether he was divine or not, he knew there was something special about Joseph and Jacob. And I don't know if he believed there was a God or not, but there's always a little tinge that goes, there was something that probably kicked him on the positive side of this is different. Because nobody else could interpret the dreams but Joseph. And then we talked about the bad Pharaoh, dealing with Moses and Aaron. We saw what obstinance, hard-headedness, pride can get us when we get into that point. But ultimately we saw what happened there. We talked about when they crossed the Red Seas, a new life started. A new thing for Moses and the nation of Israel. We talked about all the changes that were to take place and ultimately how it led up to the birth of Christ. Today we're going to talk about Rehoboam, Solomon's son. But I gave a handout today with the thing on Rehoboam about Solomon, Jeroboam, and Rehoboam. It's on the back of it. I think we need to understand, before we get into the study today, each what happened, because we're not going to study Jeroboam, we're just going to get into Rehoboam. And that's on the back that gives a brief lesson on each. What happened with Jeroboam, with Solomon, when Solomon found out that obviously Elijah, the prophet, had approached him, tore his garments and said, I'm giving you 10, he's getting the others. When Solomon found out, obviously he tried to kill him. So he fled to Egypt under Nebat, I think was his name, where he was protected until Solomon died. He tried to come back, speak with Rehoboam, and then we're going to get into, this is where the split takes place today. I would encourage you to read 1st and 2nd Kings quite a bit, and Chronicles also, because it deals a lot with Solomon. It deals a lot with Rehoboam, Jeroboam. It does a lot with the split and what transpired. And I think at that point, you have to understand that they wanted kings, and you got to be careful what sometimes you ask for, because if you do, it may not be good. So if you look at your cards that were handed out that Justin had, you're going to see that all the kings, the good and the bad kings. And if you look at Rehoboam, you look at Jeroboam, it's not a good thing. You know, they're red. I mean, neither one of these guys were good. So I'm going to give a brief history on Rehoboam, then we're going to get into the lesson today. Solomon reigned for 40 years and he died. And then Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. 1 Kings 12, 1 through 3 says, Now Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it was when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard it, he was still in Egypt. Now remember, he'd already fled because Solomon was trying to kill him because of what the prophet had told him. He'd been dwelling in Egypt, and they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole congregation of Israel, these are 10 tribes that were with Jeroboam, came and spoke to Rehoboam. The people spoke to Rehoboam, requesting that Solomon's yoke of heavy, burdensome services be lightened, and they would serve him. Rehoboam told him to come back in 3 days for his answer. That would give him time to consult with the elders who had stood before his father Solomon. So I want you to here's about what's to happen. He had the elders, who were the wiser men, and we're not talking about elders like today, but they were wiser men back then, who Solomon relied on a lot of times for wisdom. What do we do? What's going on? But Rehoboam then made a costly, tragic mistake. 1 Kings 12:8 says, But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. Now you have to understand, when you grow up with somebody, you have kind of like mind, like ideas. You do things together and everything else. So sometimes they can sway your opinion. Sometimes we listen to wisdom. Sometimes we listen to what tickles our ears. And that's the path we follow. Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. He's about to drop the hammer on them. Rehoboam took the advice of his peers and answered the people roughly and rejected the advice that the elders had given him. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, they departed to their own tents and left Rehoboam to figure out how he would maintain the kingdom. Where were his peers at this point? Where were they in his central masterminding? All Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, so they sent for him and made him king over all the congregations, the 10. The kingdom was now divided. 10 of the tribes were now under Jeroboam's rule. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained in Jerusalem under Rehoboam's rule. 1 Kings 12, 16 through 21. His decision split and splintered God's people. God had already determined that the kingdom would be divided. He'd already talked about this before it happened. But you know, if you always stop and think about Cain and Abel, what they do, he was warned, don't do this. He did it anyway. I've often wondered how we can be so hard-headed at times when we're dealing with deity directly. His decision splintered God's people. God had already determined, as I said, in 1 Kings 11 through 13, and 34 through 38. However, Rehoboam ignored the wisdom that could have avoided ruin for he and his people. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all of their fathers had done. This is pretty bad. With the sins which they committed. 1 Kings 14:22. Rehoboam's legacy was further condemnation of Judah for the lack of faithfulness. Because of their unfaithfulness, Egypt plundered and captured Judah's cities. 2 Chronicles 12, 1 through 19. So I want to make sure that we understand the difference in the books of what 1st and 2nd Kings covered in the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The Chronicles describes especially the kingdom of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. There were 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The book of Kings describes mostly Israel. That's the northern kingdom. That's the 10 tribes. Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. The Chronicles only mention Israel when it comes to contact with Judah. So make sure you understand the segregation of the two because they focus on each individual tribe or each king at the time, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And I wanted to bring that up today because we're not going to spend a lot of time. I would encourage you that if you have time, 1st and 2nd Kings and the Chronicles are fantastic historical perspectives and inspirationally inspired books to read. Take the time to read them. It's amazing how God worked with people at that time and how they could ignore him and cause such division for at that time, which were his chosen people. All right, here we go. Questions on anything before we get started? Everybody get a handout this morning? Just a brief handout on Solomon, Rehoboam, and Jeroboam for better understanding. Here we go. Hypocrisy, roots, and tragedy. The word hypocrisy has its roots in the Greek theatrical scene where one would play different persons in a play. Have you seen this play out in real life? People want to be what they're not. All the audience saw was the mask, the pretense. The term came to refer to those who were playing a part in daily life. However, their intention was not to amuse, but to deceive, to gain popular acceptance by playing a part, when in reality they were insincere. How many times we run into this in life daily? Whether it's in the professional world, our friends, relatives, things like that. Such play acting brings tragic consequences in earthly life and eternal consequences after this life. The condemnation is summed up by recognizing the hypocrite as untruthful and self-centered. Mm-hmm. I love this. Oh, I know that works. There we go. It doesn't say the batteries are bad. Maybe it's just me. I don't know how to punch it. The scripture warns about hypocrisy. I gave these scriptures If you want them, I can give them to you, but I think I almost want to call it a disease. It infected so many people. And ultimately, in the end, what it does, it always catches up with you. Usually the outcome's not good. When someone's put in a position to defend what it is they did or something else, it usually causes strife and issues. The problem with hypocrisy has long plagued mankind. It began with Adam and Eve, continued with Cain, and survives very well in our modern day. The fourth king of Israel illustrates this tragedy all too well. Rehoboam became king of Israel upon the death of his father Solomon. I'm sorry. I apologize. So just holler. I say I'll always slow down. It's so hard. Sometimes I just need to put my brain in neutral. There's so much when you spend the time studying the split and how it got up to the kings, and you delve into it deeply, it's a sad, sad story. That once you realize when Jacob died, what was going to transpire after Joseph buried him. It gets sad from there on out, because at that point out, there's no other way to say it. The nation of Israel is doomed. It's pretty much all over that, and it takes a while, but they headed down a path that they're not going to recover from, and that should be a lesson for us today. We're headed down a path that can be very dangerous. In all nations, history has shown that have gone down this path have never, ever recovered. We think of Nineveh, but a short while, and then ultimately they were destroyed. And I look at today, I was reading something yesterday, and I'm trying to think of who, I think it may have been the Barna study from 2022. I said a little over 20% of Americans today believe in the inspiration of the Bible. Think about that, folks. We're a rare breed, but remember, we're a peculiar people anyway. That's how it would be. It's different. But it's also scary to think that that number is declining each day when you look at society as a whole. You look at what's going on with television and print media and our educational system. And where are parents today? Are they taking the time to spend with their kids? And we've got a lot of works going on here today now that I'm appreciative for those who are involved. We got things like Last to Leaders going on. We have events with the young teens. We have the young men's led worship. I think that's all important as we start molding, and I hate to use that term because it's, you want them to be able to think, but to help them understand that they're going to face challenges in life, and the more they're grounded in the faith today, the easier it comes to deal with it later on. And I'm not saying they're going to be successful. We all know that that doesn't always happen, but it's nice to know that if they know, they do stand a chance when they face things that are so wrong today. You got it, Victor? Okay. Very quite welcome. I'm sorry it went so fast. Solomon's son was made king upon the earth. So let me get my place back. Yes. When Rehoboam's reign, the second period of the Israel monarch begins. The divided kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 12. There's some discussion about, so I'm going to throw this out there, and I want you to listen to me. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I want to give you something to think about here. And that's Rehoboam's age. The more I studied this, it became a very interesting concept on how some words may have been interpreted from the Hebrew and over. So listen to me very carefully. There's some discussion about Rehoboam's age at the time he became king. 1 Kings 14:21 and 2 Chronicles 12:13 indicate that he was 41 years old. But there's good evidence to suggest that he was 21 years old, and the older number is an error of transcription easily made because of the practice of using Hebrew letters of the alphabet as numerals. Here are some reasons supporting this earlier age. So this is just study, guys. I'm not saying this, We have the scriptures. So he is described in 2 Chronicles 13:7 as being young and tenderhearted. The LXX, which is a Septuagint, meaning 70, actually refers to the 72 translators, 6 from each tribe of Israel, involved in translating the Pentateuch from Hebrew to Greek in the 3rd century. And you say, well, if there was 6 of each, that would have been 72, but why does it say 70? Well, 2, I don't know why. History reflects why 2 of them were left out. Excuse me. I thought for a minute I was in trouble, going to have to use my sleeve. No, Becky, I didn't mean that. There's not enough time for Rehoboam to have been 41 at the time of his ascension to king. So here, listen to this. Rehoboam would have had to have been 1 year old at the time of David's death. But Solomon was described as being young and tender at that time. Rehoboam's counselors, the young men, are said to have grown up with him. Okay? They were the same age as Rehoboam, and the Septuagint calls those in that group lads in 12:8. It's just a thought. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I did find the study interesting. But then again, I think about the words inspired and the men that wrote it. So it's just a thought. Because there's some other thoughts out there that are very interesting when you think about the age of Christ. What transpired at 30 or 33. Interesting studies also. Now notice, let's see, so let me see. Yeah, constant war. Can you imagine? You brought them out of Egyptian bondage, crossed the Red Sea, you got a new life. And sometimes as little as 2 chapters, things change. I don't know how many years that expand, but when you read 2 chapters, it changed. It's amazing. So let's talk about hypocrisy. Notice 4 events in Rehoboam's reign that reveal his hypocrisy. He had seen Solomon's later years. Solomon had lived a dual standard, confessing the one God, yet tolerating an influential presence of many foreign gods. Outwardly, it appeared the king was devoted to God, but was only a mask being worn. So let me throw another thing in here about Jeroboam too. Jeroboam ripped Solomon for what he did. You have to understand this too. Even though Solomon made him a very powerful person, Jeroboam told him he was wrong for what he was doing. Now, you're standing up to a king and you're saying you're wrong. Now, how is that usually going to get you anywhere? But he didn't punish him. He only went to kill him after it was told that 10 of the tribes would become his. Because at the time, Rehoboam was his son, not Jeroboam. See how this works with the oldest, the generational thing? The son's subsequent life illustrates how critical sincerity is in training children. His mother and father were mean. You know, you had to look at what he grew up in. Worship gods and goddesses and all these other things. And at the same time, you got a father who's straddling the fence, going back and forth, back and forth. So what's it going to do to you? Your parents tell you one thing, but they do something else. Often too many times, they do as they see and not as you say, which is totally opposite of what we always hear. As he accepted the throne, Rehoboam's 2-sided character becomes visible. The 4 incidents reveal Rehoboam as a king who appeared to be something that he was not. He was a king playing a rehearsed role, wearing a pretend mask for the public eye, but behind the scenes he nurtured the life of self-indulgence. So let's talk about these 4 events that reveal his hypocrisy. The request at the beginning of 1 Kings 12, 1 and 20, and then 2 Chronicles 10, 1 through 15. This is the most memorable event in Rehoboam's career, and it is also the most revealing about his true character. A group petitions Rehoboam for a change in taxation. We talked about that, Jeroboam and them. Although we are not directly informed about the motivation of this group, later we see it was because of tribal jealousy. That was Ephraim, 12:16. Rehoboam appeared to be concerned. He talked with Solomon's advisors and then with those of his peer group. The result was action that split and splintered God's people. So you see what opinions can do, folks, to the Lord's church? You listen to the wrong people. You don't prescribe to the word. Rehoboam never intended to change the policies of Solomon, but he went through the motions of pretending he was. Remember he said, give me a few days and I'll get back with you, like he was sincere? The king's resolve is seen in the following. The elders pled for Rehoboam to become servant to the people in chapter 12, verse 7. The elders were not necessarily old men, but the term refers to those judged capable of governing and offering counsel, similar to the aldermen who represent those capable of deciding issues for the public. They were the recognized assistants of Solomon. Again, Rehoboam forsook the counsel of the wise. Rehoboam then gathered those of his own peer groups. Notice the change in pronouns used for the group, and that's in verse 9, if you're into that stuff. So he compared with the elders. The choice had already been made. All Rehoboam needed was support for his choice. He never intended to change this. It was a facade. And ultimately he came back and he dropped the hammer on it, made it worse. All appeared that Rehoboam was trying to gain a reasoned judgment, but it was all pretenses. Rehoboam consulted with everyone except God. The reason is obvious. The king's mind was made up. He was allowing self. The pretense led to the next event, the civil war with Israel. Again, we could spend a lot of time, like I said, in Kings and Chronicles discussing this. There's so much here. You know, you can just encourage you if you take the time to read it and study it. It's amazing. The harsh response ignited the smoldering jealousies of Ephraim, and war was called. Rehoboam was determined to take an army and compel Jeroboam's followers to submit. Now think about this. Not long ago, they were all on the same side. Now he wants to destroy them. Suddenly a prophet, Shemaiah, well, anyway, I got it in my notes if you want it, appeared and told Rehoboam to cease the war in verse 4. It appears that Rehoboam did what the prophet commanded, but off stage, the real scene was that of continual escalation towards war. We read that in verses 5 through 12, 2 Chronicles 11. To the outward observer, it appeared Rehoboam was relaxing and trusting God. Behind the scenes, he was aggressively preparing for war. And then the idolatry of Jerusalem. During Rehoboam's tenure, well, if somebody could read 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 21 through 24. Somebody could read that, please. 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 21 through 24. First Kings 14, 21 through 24.
Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And his mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all their fathers had done. With the sins they had committed, for they also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars and Asherim in every high hill and beneath every luxury tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land, but they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel.
See what's going on here? Jerusalem was supposed to be the city of the Lord. You see what Rehoboam did? That's the point I wanted to make. When he got there, that's what it was supposed to be. In reality, it had become a city dedicated to idolatry and sin. It's just read by Craig. On the surface, Jerusalem bore the Lord's name. It was his city. However, the city, like Rehoboam, was really a whitewashed tomb full of death, decay, and sin. Wow. We think about Sodom and Gomorrah. You tell me we don't have a patient God? This was supposed to be his city, and look what Rehoboam did to it. The pillage of Shishak. 2 Chronicles 12, 1 through 12. Because of Rehoboam's hypocrisy, God brought the king of Egypt against Jerusalem. Consequently, the temple and palace were plundered of Solomon's treasures, verses 9 through 11. The situation cast an alarming shadow upon Rehoboam's tenure. What would the population think of their king who surrendered the national treasures? 1 Kings 10, 16 through 17 describes the shields of gold that were taken by Egypt. To help conceal his betrayal, Rehoboam cleverly arranged for shields to be made out of bronze, polished, and replaced the golden shields that were taken by the Egyptians. He worked hard behind the scenes to cover up the loss, and through the special effects department, as they would say, he managed to make the phony bronze substitute seem like the real thing. To strengthen the illusion, he kept people and shields away from public view. You could only see them from a distance. Pretty clever of him, wasn't it? Even though he had lost it all to the Egyptians. So let's talk about the elements of his hypocrisy. How are they seen in our modern day? His hypocrisy brings tragedy. He was willing to listen to everyone except God. Someone read 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 5, please. 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 5. Second Timothy 4, 3 through 5.
And the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of the evangelist, fulfill your ministry.
What were you the young lads who he grew up with, his ears were tickled, and he could care less about the people. I think sometimes that's a lesson for us. You know, depending how things go in this country, those in power can determine what we're allowed to do. And sometimes I think the government gets too strong. They've taken it away from the state level, which was how it was intended to be initially, governing. They in turn have stepped over the boundaries and they control the states now. And that's a scary concept because it only makes them stronger daily. And as they get stronger, we will fuss and we will complain. But once they get their people embedded and in place, you've seen it through the judicial systems today. Through decades, what has happened to the judicial system today? But we should always stop and think there's examples for us. We just need to pay attention and heed what's happened in the past. Will repeat itself again in the future. He had neither time nor desire to consult and follow God's directions. He was wholly devoted to self and refused to consider anything else. So here's a point. How tragic. Many today seek validation and support for beliefs and practices from everyone except God. How disheartening it is to see those who leave God's truth and are encouraged by others to continue practicing hypocritical religions, actions, and remain in rebellion to the Almighty's will. Questions and comments on that statement? Yeah, Victor.
I see people trying to push it a little bit when they say today, oh, why God doesn't speak to us now, why He's not manifesting Himself. But over the centuries, we have been the ones making God speak quiet. We try to avoid Him, we try to ignore Him all over. And this is an example in the nations of the world as well, like with pharaohs, for example, trying to ignore every single time. I mean, how many times we need for God to talk to us and tell us and do things that are affecting us, like to Him. And when Jesus came, same story, and who was it? Stephen? Was talking about how the people, the prophets, were killing were killed by the people of Israel. So it was not just other nations, it was them too. And to pretend that we want to hear God now, just go to the Bible and learn.
You see, that's a valid point. We always need to understand. In the beginning, God dealt directly with man. He dealt with the father in the household. And I mean, when he punished you, he punished you. We need to understand as time went on and the word became written and inspired, he drew farther away from man. Not from the sense of spirituality, but from physical aspects. Okay? And in the end, when Jesus died and the veil was torn down, it was pretty clear. You've got everything you need. I'm not going to deal with you directly anymore like I did in the past. You've got the written word, which is inspired, folks. Take the time and read it and study it. Therein lies your salvation. Because can you imagine a lot of us, if we lived back then, the way he punished people? Because remember this, they could pray that the mountains would fall on them and hide them from his ultimate destruction, and they couldn't get away from it. Anyway, he succeeded in keeping it hid, his hypocrisy, from the public. Had his motives, thoughts, intentions been exposed to the public eye, he would never have succeeded. He was subtle and crafty in his work. Many today are encouraging error because they see only the facade and not the real situation. Words are redefined to conceal the truth. Biblical terms are used, but in meanings that are foreign to the Scripture's real meaning. Many will accept these redefined words without realizing the corrupt doctrines they mask. And again, 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 2 talks about that. We won't read that right now. He cared not for established wisdom. The elders had been designated by God and used by Moses, Saul, David, and Solomon to govern Israel. Their counsel would have avoided this division, but their counsel was unattractive to someone devoted to self. Rehoboam never gave the elders serious consideration. The king never saw their wisdom. He never identified as being with them. He wanted to be different. We saw what it got him. 2 Thessalonians 2 through 4 talks about that. He worked from emotions and appearance instead of facts. The facts would have required him to become a servant. This would mean his devotion to self could never be nurtured. So he contrived facts, manipulated the situation, and played the part. But all was phony. He could not survive if he followed the facts. 2 Thessalonians 2, 11 and 12 talk about this. He rested on his perspective instead of God's truth. God's truth exposed his self-centeredness, his hypocrisy, his phoniness. It was more comforting to him to look through distorted perspectives that gave Rehoboam the support for his hypocrisy. You always hear that, what is that, rose-colored glasses? People use that term. You see it the way you want to. How tragic that many do this today. They reject God's truth because it is too demanding. They find a greater comfort in their own perspectives for doctrine. 2 Thessalonians 2:15 talks about the same thing. He willingly split God's people because of selfishness. Folks, I would hate to stand in front of God knowing that I caused a split in the church, God's people, because of an opinion. That could be pretty rough. The United Kingdom ceased to exist because Rehoboam was more concerned about himself than about God. How tragic is this attitude today? His hypocrites split and splinter God's kingdom because they're more devoted to selfish indulgences than to God's divine truth. These modern-day Rehoboams continue the legacy of their phony forefathers and create open and irreparable breaches in the Lord's people. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 17 talks about such. Let's talk about the tragedy of his reign. The greatest tragedy of Rehoboam's reign is that it can be summarized by the words folly. What a remarkable contrast is found between Solomon, who at 20 years is known to be the wisest man of all times, and Rehoboam at age 21, or 41 years, is known as the greatest fool of all times. Let's talk about the traits united to make Rehoboam such a great fool. His feebleness of character. consumed by self. Instead of wholeheartedly devotion to God, he was consumed with self. His contempt for experience despised the elders. Instead of seizing the rich wisdom offered by the elders, he despised the counsel because it was unpleasant. His resort to the foolish and agreed with him. Instead of recognizing the counsel of the younger as unwise, he accepted it because it agreed with him. His trust in personal power, he thought he was invincible. Instead of recognizing his insincerity, his insecurity and weaknesses, he thought he and his immature counselors were invincible. How many times have we thought that? Just to be slapped down to reality. That's probably happened to all of us one time in our life. Probably not Jack, but hey, not all of us are perfect. Let's talk about the lessons from Rehoboam. How tempting is it to trust self instead of God? It's a discussion question. How tempting is it? How many times do we make decisions based on what a friend or family member tells us versus if it's a spiritual matter, we wonder where we need to find the answer? Steve?
Course of events to trust our own wisdom first and foremost, and then when we fail, then we turn to God in prayer. It just seems to be our nature as human beings, or maybe a product of our society.
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, 9/11, what happened? Churches were full. People turned to God. How could this happen? 8 months later, where were they? Back to the world, back to themselves. I don't get it. When times are bad, we want to turn to the one, and I say this carefully, who we, depending on our situation, think can help us. I also said depending on our situation. So, because even the demons feared him. They knew about him. Division is prompted by selfishness. Opinion. Selfishness. Question or comments? Okay. When self negotiates, you lose everything. Self persuades that our perspective is the highest authority. I think one of the hardest things, like I said, I learned in my travels was listening to people sometimes. Because you go in with a preconceived solution, and what you find out is reality doesn't always work that way. So after a couple of countries, I learned I'm going in and asking questions and hitting the floor. I'm going to figure this out. Yes, ma'am.
Where, not saying the greater you can seek the wisdom of the Lord, seek His righteousness, try to attain that. And I think that's part of what we get convinced that, because I sought it to begin with, then clearly the choices I'm going to make now are God approved. Because what I did in the past to get right now, I was seeking His wisdom. So, we almost convince ourselves that, we can do it on our own because of the basis was with God. And Solomon's demonstrating that, and that's clearly where Rehoboam grew up seeing the end of Solomon, right? And not necessarily the beginning. And that's the example he saw.
And yeah, we're products of our own environment sometimes. I think we can change. I think it's harder for people in some environments to change. Because sometimes it's easier to keep things the way they are, than think to change. So, Jack?
Well, Solomon was very prophetic when he said, pride comes before the fall. This was before Rehoboam probably was born. He wrote that. But he defined pride, and the comments defined pride. He had it in his mind, he was gonna go that direction because he was right. And that's pride.
And you're right, because you had to see his father, who was persuaded by his wives and his concubines and the gods and goddesses. I mean, his dad did whatever he wanted, had whatever he needed, except the one thing that he turned from. And it cost him dearly. And it winded up doing a lot of damage when the United Kingdom became the divided kingdom. Good point, John. Good point, Baal. Self never fools God. We need to remember that. He looks behind our mask into our hearts. Guys, he knows what's going on. We can't fool him. We can try. Here's Rehoboam's legacy. Condemnation of Judah for their lack of faithfulness to the Lord. Because of their unfaithfulness, Egypt plundered and captured Judah's cities. Again, 2 Chronicles 12, 1 through 9. And I wanted to give a quick thing on Jeroboam, because here's what we don't understand when Elijah, I think that's the prophet's name, spoke to him. Here's what God told Jeroboam. The promise made to Jeroboam for obedience to him is astounding. God had said that it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, keep my statutes and my commandments, and my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house, as I built for David, and will give Israel to you. You see, he hadn't made. That's what astounds me. God told him this. And what did he do? Jeroboam's another fascinating study. He was a bad, bad king. So, questions or comments? Yeah, Craig. Yep.
Lizzie, or
Yeah.
did he must have gone against that wisdom, even in his fall to idolatry. I mean, it is that wisdom God had given him, either that or you just got so numb to, but he had to have known this isn't right.
We've always heard the old saying, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. When you associate with the wrong people, after a while, they're going to impact your decisions and what you do. I don't care how wise you are. And when you've got wives and concubines and all these other people who worship gods and goddesses pushing at you, it's going to rub on you after a while. And you're going to tend to lean that way. You know, exactly. That's what he did. And I think the sad thing is when you study him, he actually knew later on, when you get into, I think it is Ecclesiastes and some other things, when he talks about that, but he didn't really reckon and change. He just kept it up. And you saw what it did, ultimately. And history shows us what it did, because there were very, 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 on Jeroboam's side, there was only one possibly good king. On Rehoboam's side, I think there were 3 or 4 and some so-so. But ultimately, most of them were just bad, bad people. And the nation suffered for it. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
You know, when you're studying the Second Kings and Chronicles, there's a lot of evil going on through all of them, and it's really ugly. And almost every time when you read, it always says he did evil in the sight of the Lord on these kings. So comparing that with today, it's kind of like a repeat of history. And even some of it is even going the way that people died. There was some pretty bad deaths back there, froze, stoned, eaten by dogs, all that stuff.
It is sad. It is a sad commentary when you read those 4 books. You know, because it's really sad what can happen to us if we turn from God. And it's not just an immediate thing, it's generational. As you see from the different kings, and it got worse and worse and worse and worse until ultimately 70 AD, God had enough. And he used the most ruthless people in the world to take his people down. That was the Romans. Because people talk about how bad Rome was. Remember this, the Greeks invented torture. Rome perfected it. They could keep you alive for days and torture you. That's how bad it was. But anyway, let's have a closing prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, we are grateful for the time we have together to study more of your word and understand that if we remain faithful and follow your teachings and the wisdom that lies within the Old and the New Testament, that we can stand in your sight one day, comfortably knowing that we have obeyed the gospel and done your will. It challenges us each day to read, to study of those who've gone on before us, some good, some bad. Ultimately, what will happen to us if we go down that trail of pride and sinfulness? We're thankful for the time together, for the comments. We pray this morning that all things that have been taught are scripturally sound and in accordance with your will. We thank you again for the time together and look forward to this hour of worship for those men who serve. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.